Let's talk about what really happens when you stop being available to the avoidant. Because for so long, you've been bending, waiting, texting, explaining, overfunctioning in a relationship where they kept you guessing, hot one day, cold the next. You were available every time they came back around, hoping this time they'd finally show up for real. But something changed. You woke up. You realized your energy is valuable, your peace is sacred, and your availability is not a gift for people who don't know how to value it. And the second you stop being their emotional safety net, their backup plan, their comfort zone, the power dynamic shifted. When you stop being available to an avoidant partner, the first and most profound thing that happens is this. You remove their emotional safety net. Whether they admit it or not, avoidant individuals rely heavily on knowing that you're there, that no matter how far they pull away, no matter how cold they get, no matter how much they create distance, you will still be emotionally available. You'll still reach out. You'll still answer. You'll still hold the door open, even when they're halfway out of it. That availability gives them the illusion of control. It allows them to feel safe while keeping intimacy at arm's length. But when you stop showing up, when you stop reaching out, when you stop being the one who smooths things over, the avoidant loses that built-in reassurance. And suddenly, what they once took for granted feels noticeably absent. You've taken away the thing they were banking on, your consistent emotional presence. That absence hits different. It forces them to confront a reality they've spent their lives avoiding. Closeness doesn't just wait around forever. People don't stay emotionally open while being emotionally neglected. Avoidants often build their relationships on a subconscious belief that they can maintain connection without true vulnerability, that they can keep people close while keeping their own emotions protected. But your availability challenged that narrative. It invited them into something deeper, more real, and that scared them. So they did what they always do. They distanced, they withdrew, they protected their independence at the expense of intimacy. And while you were right there trying to make it work, they assumed you always would be. But the moment you stop playing that role, you trigger something they weren't ready for, the collapse of the emotional safety net. And that creates an entirely new internal experience for the avoidant. Suddenly, your silence becomes louder than your words ever were. Your absence becomes a confrontation. It makes them feel the very thing they were trying to avoid, emotional vulnerability, not in the form of closeness, but in the form of loss. And here's where it gets real. Avoidants are not immune to missing someone. They just have a delayed emotional response. They don't process loss in real time. They don't feel the impact when you're still trying, still texting, still hoping. They feel it when you stop. They feel it when they check their phone and see no missed calls. When they expect to see you watching their story and you're not. When they go to re-engage in the pattern and find that the pattern is gone. That's the moment the emotional safety net is fully gone. And for the first time, they have to sit with the consequences of their emotional detachment. They have to face the reality that connection requires presence. And presence is something they didn't offer while you were giving yours freely. They're left to wonder, did I push them too far? Did I wait too long? Why aren't they chasing me this time? And that internal questioning starts to chip away at the emotional armor they've spent years building. This is not about playing games. This is about no longer participating in a dynamic that depletes you. It's about reclaiming your space, your energy, and your self-worth. The avoidant may not show it on the surface. They're experts at masking emotion. But when you remove your emotional availability, they feel it in their nervous system, in the silence, in the lack of control. And that creates a discomfort they can't easily run from. So when you stop being available to the avoidant, you don't just disappear from their world, you disrupt the illusion they've lived by, that people will always be there no matter how disconnected they are. You force them to confront a truth they've tried to ignore. You can't hold on to people while pushing them away. And maybe, just maybe, that's the beginning of their awakening. But more importantly, it's the beginning of yours. When you stop being available to an avoidant, something deeply psychological gets triggered, their fear of loss. But here's the twist. Avoidants don't respond to loss the way most people do. While someone securely attached might react immediately to the loss of connection, avoidants tend to suppress, delay, and rationalize. They tell themselves they don't need anyone. They convince themselves they're better off alone. In the short term, your silence might even feel like relief to them. because space is what they crave when intimacy feels threatening. But that relief is temporary, and eventually the silence starts to echo. The distance you create doesn't just make you disappear, it makes them feel something they've worked hard not to feel, the emotional weight of your absence. Avoidance fear engulfment, being emotionally consumed or controlled, but what they fear just as much, and often even more deeply, is abandonment. The difference is, they don't process that fear in real time. They preemptively create distance so they don't have to face the pain of being left. But when you stop being available, it forces them to experience the very abandonment they were trying to avoid, not because you left them, but because you stopped waiting around for them to decide when and how you're allowed to exist in their life. At first, they might intellectualize it, and probably just busy, and they're being dramatic, then they'll come back. Avoidants often live in denial because it protects them from emotional vulnerability. As time passes and you remain silent, no check-ins, no apologies, no emotional outreach, they begin to feel the weight of that loss. They realize that the emotional control they once had over the situation is slipping. And that's when panic creeps in, even if they don't show it outwardly. Your silence begins to strip away their illusion of control. That illusion gave them comfort, the belief that they could come and go, that you would always be there, that they could delay commitment without consequence. But when your availability disappears, their entire dynamic with you changes. Suddenly, they're not the one managing closeness. They're not calling the emotional shots. You are, by stepping back, by not being emotionally accessible, by no longer putting their needs ahead of your own. This shift in control doesn't just create discomfort. It activates their buried fears. The fear that maybe they really did lose you, that maybe you've realized your worth, that maybe this time you're not coming back. And for an avoidant, that kind of realization is terrifying because it forces them to acknowledge that people don't stay when they're constantly pushed away, that even the most loyal person reaches a breaking point. That silence isn't always a game. Sometimes it's a boundary. Sometimes it's the sound of someone choosing themselves. And that realization can stir up a level of emotional turmoil the avoidant is not prepared to handle. They may not know how to process it. They may try to distract themselves, date someone else, bury their feelings in work, or pretend they don't care. But underneath that facade is a nervous system that's starting to panic. Because what they once took for granted, your emotional presence, has been replaced by uncertainty. And avoidants hate uncertainty more than they admit. They like to be the one who creates space. But when you create it, when you hold it, when you don't chase them or fill the gap they left behind, that's when the fear kicks in. They begin to question what happened, not just what you did, but what they did. They think about the last conversation, the last time they pulled away, the last time they ignored a message or dismissed your feelings. And for someone who avoids emotions, that kind of reflection can be overwhelming. It's a slow burn, the kind that creeps up late at night when the distractions fade, the kind that shows up in their dreams, in random moments, in that lingering ache they can't explain. So yes, your distance does something powerful. It forces the avoidant to feel, not right away, not in the dramatic, emotional way you might expect, but in the quiet, internal way that rattles their carefully constructed defenses. It makes them face the reality that their fear of closeness cost them something, you. And that fear of loss? That's when they finally begin to feel what you felt all along. Not because you made them feel it, but because your absence spoke louder than your presence ever could. When you stop being available to an avoidant, something fundamental shifts beneath the surface, the power dynamic. For so long, they were the one who dictated the pace. They decided when to engage, when to pull away, when to talk, and when to disappear. You were the emotionally available one, the consistent one, the one holding space for the relationship while they kept their distance. And maybe you didn't even realize it at the time, but you were playing into a silent contract. They would lead the emotional dance and you would follow, waiting, hoping, adjusting yourself to their comfort zone. But when you withdraw your availability, the unspoken rules of that dynamic collapse. Suddenly, you're no longer the one trying to fix things. You're not the one texting first, apologizing for things you didn't do, or asking, "Are you okay?" for the 100th time. You stop chasing, explaining, overthinking. You stop softening your needs just to make them comfortable. And when that shift happens, it creates a ripple effect. because the avoidant has built their entire emotional rhythm around knowing that you're there, that you'll reach out, that you'll hold space for them, even when they don't hold it for you. So when you remove yourself from that equation, they feel it, not just as distance, but as a loss of control. They no longer get to set the emotional temperature of the relationship. The power they once had, the power to pull you in and push you away, begins to evaporate. And for someone who is used to holding emotional power, by keeping others at bay, this shift is destabilizing. Suddenly, they're not the one managing closeness. You are. And that creates a deep psychological discomfort. Avoidants often rely on the security of knowing that they can return when they're ready, that the door will always be open. Your availability allowed them to feel emotionally safe while staying emotionally detached. But now the roles are reversed. You're no longer holding space for their indecision. You're not standing still while they drift. You're moving forward. You're reclaiming your peace. And that is what shifts the power dynamic completely. Here's the truth most people miss. Emotional availability is power. When you are the one showing up, being honest, being vulnerable, you're actually holding more power than you think. But the avoidant doesn't see it that way at first. They interpret your openness as weakness. They think, why need me more than I need them? But when you stop showing up, when you stop being available to be pulled back in, that illusion of superiority cracks. They realize that you were not weak, you were invested, that you weren't desperate, you were loyal, that your effort wasn't a lack of self-respect, it was love. And now the absence of that effort exposes how much they relied on it. And here's where it gets real. The power dynamic doesn't shift because you're trying to punish them. It shifts because you're finally choosing yourself. You're no longer investing in someone who only shows up when it's convenient. You've stopped making excuses for someone who disappears when things get emotionally real. And in doing that, you've changed the rules of engagement. If they want to reconnect, it's no longer on their terms. It's not enough for them to breadcrumb you, send a vague text, or show up just enough to keep you emotionally hooked. That no longer works because the old dynamic is gone. Now they have to rise to meet you. They have to earn back access to your energy, and that is unfamiliar territory for an avoidant. They're not used to being the one who pursues. They're not used to feeling emotionally exposed. But that's exactly what happens when the dynamic shifts. They're the ones wondering, why aren't they reaching out? Why aren't they responding like they used to? Did I lose them? And the power they once had, the power to keep you emotionally dependent, is gone. This shift isn't about control, it's about liberation. It's about no longer allowing your emotional life to revolve around someone else's avoidance. And when you take your power back, everything changes. You stop living in emotional reaction to their behavior. You stop waiting. You stop settling. And whether they realize what they lost or not, you have already won because you've stepped out of a dynamic that was never built to nourish you. You've stopped being available, and in doing so, you've reclaimed the most important relationship you'll ever have, the one with yourself. When you stop being available to an avoidant, your silence becomes louder than anything you could ever say. It speaks volumes, not in anger, not in revenge, but in power. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, words are something they can dodge. Conversations can be deflected. Emotions can be minimized. They can ghost, shut down, or act indifferent in the face of your tears, your explanations, or your pleas for clarity. But silence? Silence is different. Silence can't be argued with. It can't be reasoned away. It just is. It creates a void, one they can no longer control, and that void becomes a mirror, forcing them to face what they tried to avoid all along. Avoidants rely on emotional noise to maintain distance. They often create confusion, mixed signals, and hot and cold behavior because it keeps you off balance, always trying to interpret what's happening, always trying to close the gap. They stay in the driver's seat by keeping the dynamic uncertain. But when you stop speaking, when you stop reacting, when you step out of that emotional tug of war, they're left with stillness. And in that stillness, they have to sit with the consequences of their emotional avoidance. Your silence is not just the absence of communication. It's a boundary. It's you saying, I'm not chasing you anymore and not trying to fix what you keep breaking. I'm done proving my worth to, who's afraid of intimacy. That quiet boundary is one of the most powerful things you can set. especially with someone who's used to holding emotional distance as a shield, because suddenly they can't feel your energy anymore. And whether they admit it or not, they felt safer knowing you were still there. They felt comfort in the idea that no matter how much space they created, you would always close the gap. Now they're the one sitting in the discomfort. They're the one wondering what happened. And that discomfort is important. Not because you want to hurt them, but because it's often the only thing that makes them reflect. Avoidants don't tend to process emotional impact while it's happening. They suppress, compartmentalize, and distract themselves. But silence isn't something they can suppress. It lingers. It causes them to notice things they never paid attention to before. The fact that you haven't viewed their story, that your name no longer pops up on their phone, that the "ungood morning" text is missing, that the pattern is broken, that the energy, your energy, is gone. And it's not just that they miss the communication. They miss the emotional certainty you provided. You were the one who made things feel stable, even in their detachment, even in their fear of closeness. You gave them something solid to return to. Now that you've gone silent, they have to reckon with the possibility that maybe, for once, the door won't reopen, that maybe you've really walked away, and that silence creates more introspection than any long conversation ever could. What your silence ultimately does is shift the responsibility back to them. You're no longer managing their emotions, their moods, or their inconsistencies. You've stepped back and said, if you want connection, you're going to have to come find me. And for someone who's spent their life avoiding vulnerability, that's a terrifying realization, because it means they now have to be the one to take emotional risks. They have to initiate, open up, and be present in a way they've never been forced to before. And if they don't, that's on them. You're no longer carrying the weight of both people's emotional labor. So don't underestimate what your silence does. It's not passive, it's not weak, it's not giving up, it's clarity, it's dignity, it's the quiet strength of someone who knows their value. And for the avoidant who's used to emotional chasing and overgiving from others, that kind of silence is unforgettable. It sticks with them. It echoes in the spaces where you used to show up. It forces them to look at themselves. And for the first time, there's no one there to cushion the impact. Your silence may never get the apology you deserve or the closure you were hoping for. But what it will get you is peace. And that peace is far more powerful than any explanation could ever be. Because the avoidant might not say it out loud, but they feel it. And your silence, it's the one thing they can't outrun. When you stop being available to an avoidant, it doesn't immediately register in their mind as a crisis. At first, it might feel like just another space in the pattern, one they're used to creating. But what they don't realize in the moment is that this space is different. It's not you giving them room and waiting in the background. It's not you quietly hoping they come back around. This time, it's you letting go. And that shift doesn't hit them like a thunderclap. It creeps in slowly, gradually, in moments they don't expect. That's when the avoidance starts to feel the delayed realization. You're not just quiet, you're gone. Avoidants are wired to protect themselves from emotional vulnerability, so when you were consistently present, they interpreted that as pressure or intensity. They feared losing themselves in connection, so they kept you at arm's length. They might have shut down when things got too close or dismissed your emotional needs to protect their sense of independence. In doing that, they convinced themselves that the relationship was something they could step in and out of, like a revolving door that always welcomed them back. But now that the door doesn't swing open on cue, reality starts to feel heavier. The realization doesn't come in one big moment. It comes in quiet waves. It might hit them when they see a photo of you, when they wake up and realize you haven't reached out, when someone mentions your name and they can't just brush it off anymore. And little by little, that distance they once felt safe behind begins to feel empty. That silence they thought they needed becomes uncomfortable. Your absence becomes undeniable. And what was once a calculated effort to maintain space now feels like a gaping hole they don't know how to fill. Avoidants typically don't process loss in the way someone with an anxious or secure attachment style might. They suppress the emotional response. They intellectualize it. They distract themselves with work, hobbies, or new connections. But none of those things address the underlying truth. They feel your absence, even if they're not ready to admit it. And because they're not in the habit of examining their own emotional patterns, the realization of what they lost comes late, sometimes months late. But when it lands hard. They begin to retrace the past. They start thinking about the moments you were there for them, the times you extended patience, understanding, love. They remember how you tried, how you stayed, how you offered closeness in ways that didn't demand but invited. And suddenly, they realize they mistook consistency for clinginess, vulnerability for weakness, and emotional safety for pressure. They realized that your presence was a gift, and they were too afraid to receive it. That delayed realization can lead to regret. They may not know how to express it. In fact, they may still struggle to reach out or take accountability. But internally, they're wrestling with the fallout of their own avoidance. They start to see that pushing people away doesn't prevent pain. It just delays it, and in many cases, it multiplies it. Because now, not only are they feeling the ache of your absence, but they're carrying the weight of knowing that it was their behavior that created it. And here's the critical piece. By the time the avoidant realizes what they lost, you've already shifted. You've already started healing. You've already begun rebuilding your self-worth without relying on their validation. That's what makes the realization so jarring for them. The version of you they took for granted no longer exists in the same way. You're stronger now. You're grounded. You're not waiting for them to catch up emotionally. The avoidance delayed realization doesn't always come with a grand gesture or a heartfelt apology. Often, it looks like small, confused attempts to reconnect, a random message, a social media like, a casual, "How have you been?" It's subtle because they're still afraid of vulnerability. But underneath those surface-level moves is a deeper truth. They finally see what they had when they had it, and they know they might not get another chance. So when you stop being available and the avoidant finally realizes they lost you, it doesn't just challenge their emotional defenses, it cracks them open. It forces them to confront the fact that connection doesn't wait for comfort, that real love doesn't linger where it's neglected, and that people who love deeply won't keep pouring into a space that never makes room for them. When you stop being available to an avoidant, the illusion that they didn't need you begins to collapse. For so long, they lived under the belief that they could keep their distance without consequence, that your love, your presence, your emotional investment would always be waiting on the other side of their silence. And to protect themselves, they told themselves they didn't need closeness. They convinced themselves they were fine alone. They built an identity around independence, around emotional detachment, around not relying on anyone. But when you finally step back, when you stop showing up, something starts to happen that they didn't anticipate. The emotional void becomes real. The space you used to fill becomes undeniable. And that's when the illusion starts to break. Avoidants are experts at minimizing emotional needs, not just yours, but their own. They learned somewhere along the way that closeness meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant risk. So they created mental walls. They downplayed their desire for connection. They labeled it as weakness or as something that would only trap them. But no one is immune to human connection. No one truly escapes the need to be seen, to be cared for, to feel emotionally safe. They may avoid it, suppress it, or pretend it doesn't matter, but it's there, underneath all the layers of self-protection. What your absence does is force them to confront a truth they've worked hard to avoid. They did rely on your presence. They did draw comfort from knowing you were there, even if they didn't say it, even if they couldn't fully show up for you. The consistency you brought, the emotional space you held, the way you kept the connection alive, all of that mattered more than they let on. And now that it's gone, they feel the weight of that loss in a way that shakes their identity. Because if they weren't as detached as they thought, then who are they without the walls? This is the emotional reckoning avoidants rarely see coming. Your distance removes the emotional scaffolding they didn't even realize they were leaning on. They may try to ignore it at first, stay busy, act unbothered, lean into distractions, but over time, the quiet moments start to catch up to them. The bed feels colder, the texts are fewer. The emotional stability they were once dismissive of now feels like a missing limb. And suddenly, the narrative that they're fine alone doesn't feel so solid. There's also a deeper layer of internal conflict that begins to stir, because now the avoidant has to face their own contradiction. The very thing they pushed away is the thing they now crave. That intimacy, that emotional safety, that bond, it wasn't a threat, it was what they needed all along. And now they have to sit with the knowledge that their fear of closeness may have cost them something real, that they didn't just lose a relationship, they lost a mirror that reflected back a healthier version of who they could have been. This isn't just about losing a partner, it's about losing the emotional anchor they didn't want to admit they relied on. The person who made them feel accepted even when they weren't perfect. The one who stayed patient through their push-pull cycles, the one who loved them despite the emotional distance. And that kind of loss cuts deep because it forces a confrontation with self, a realization that avoidance doesn't. Protect them from pain, it just delays it until it's too late to do anything about it. But here's the twist. By the time they reach this point, you've changed, you've outgrown the version of yourself that tolerated emotional breadcrumbs. You've learned what it means to be chosen, to be met halfway, to be loved without having to chase it. You're no longer the same person who waited around hoping they'd come back. And they can feel that. That shift in energy is palpable. They may try to reconnect, to test the waters, to see if the door is still open. But deep down, they know the safety net is gone. What they once took for granted is now out of reach. And what they mistook for something they didn't need turns out to be everything they were missing. That's what happens when you stop being available. You don't just teach them about your worth, you force them to question their own story. You strip away the illusion that detachment is strength, and you leave behind a silence that echoes with the truth. They didn't just lose you, they lost the version of themselves they could have become with you by their side. So here's the truth. When you stop being available to an avoidant, you're not punishing them. You're protecting your peace. You're reclaiming your energy from someone who didn't know what to do with it. And in doing so, you create the very wake-up call they never saw coming. Your silence becomes your strength. Your distance becomes your power. You're no longer begging to be seen, heard, or chosen. You're no longer dancing around their fear of intimacy. You're choosing you. And whether or not they ever admit it, feel it, or come back, they will notice the shift. Because when someone who always showed up suddenly stops, that absence leaves an impact. And in that space, you're not just giving them time to think, you're giving yourself the freedom to grow. So stop chasing, stop explaining, stop shrinking yourself to fit inside someone else's emotional limitations. Let your silence do what your words never could. Let it speak your worth. Because the moment you stop being available to the wrong kind of love is the moment you finally make room for the right one.